Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there are several developments in favor of the Russians all across the eastern section of the front line, from the very northern parts where the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of Kubiansk, as well as across the Cerebel river line. The Russians also managed to advance in the vicinity of Koshentinivka, Donetsk, and generally the east of Pokrovsk. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians also made several advances there. The Russians also advanced in the very southwestern outskirts of the Zaporizhia region, which remains under Ukrainian control. Starting out in the south, the Russians managed to advance in the northern parts of Kubiansk, gaining control over the fortified positions in the vicinity of the northern parts of the town. The Russians crossed over the river line following their full capture of the southern bank of it. With this, we see that the Russians continued offensive operations into the northern parts of the town to gain full control of it, here across the river line and onwards towards the defensive line of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia region. Over the past few days, the Russians have made numerous advances in the Zaporizhia region, indicating a new offensive operation. We also see an intensification of the Russian offensive operations in the Donetsk region, as well as in the Kharkiv region in the eastern parts of it, following the Ukrainian rotation of forces to the Sumi region, which halted the Russian advances and switched them to the defensive, while the Ukrainians went on the offensive thanks to the relocation of new troops, fresh troops, and elite troops, as well as numerous FPV drone operator units that launched numerous strikes on Russian forces, halting the advances. With this, we see that the Russians continue the same operation of relocating their forces to the weak points of the Ukrainians, forcing the Ukrainians to relocate their own forces to defend and hold the line. And once the Ukrainians redirect their forces, the Russians launch a new operation in a different area to keep the Ukrainians on the move. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians managed to advance north of Zelenopole, where they are now fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of the town, in between the border area of the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. The Russians also managed to advance slightly northeast of that, west of Vilnopole and Shevchenko. Following the capture of Shevchenko, the Russian offensive operations continue in a western direction to gain full control over the area south of the defensive line of the Ukrainians, alongside the border between the Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and Donetsk regions, where the Russians look to gain control over the border area and the fortified positions in between, and advance further in the northern direction as well to gain full control over the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region, where the Russians made numerous advances here as well, both within the Donetsk region and the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians managed to gain control over numerous fortified positions here southwest of Vilnopole, mainly from the town itself, where the Russians have launched infantry groups through their forest lines, combined with armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles that provide cover for the infantry and cover fire for their advances, gain control over the fortified positions, and they're now fighting over the next line of defense, which is these three fortified positions along the forest line here west of Vilnopole. The Russians also continue advances west of Shevchenko into the Dragon Seas and anti-tank ditches that prevents the Russians from advancing towards Komishuvakha in the western outskirts of the region. To the north, the Russians managed to gain full control over Zerka and the fortified positions, which allowed them to gain full control over the area in between the Vovcha river line in the north and the Mokry Yali river line to the west. With this, Russians can start offensive operations across the Mokry Yali river line, advancing into the western parts of the river line and to the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, mainly along the highway area itself and west of Komar, which is the main logistical hub of the Russian offensive operations, into the remaining parts of the Ukrainian control here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, as well as Vesela and Fedorivka along the fortified positions themselves. Russians are fighting over the fortified positions, and they will likely start fighting over Mirne, Pidopne, Tolstoy, and Hrushevske over the next coming days, as the Russians will continue their pressure on the Ukrainian forces within the Donetsk region. The Russians also managed to gain control over the remaining fortified positions and towns of Novoukrayinka and Dashne, here in between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk border area, gaining their first proper foothold within the Dnipropetrovsk region, besides that of the forest lines here west of Orihove. The Russians will here look to advance in the direction of Novopavlivka from the south, east, and northeast. With the recent advances in these three directions, the Russians are looking to gain control of the remaining parts of the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region to cross over and fight over Novopavlivka, which will be the main logistical hub of the Russian forces within the Dnipropetrovsk region to start off with. The Russian advances also continue north of Seleniakut and Oleksivka, where they managed to advance along the border area, gaining control of additional forest lines and roads leading to the Dnipropetrovsk border, in an attempt to gain control over the remaining parts of the border area. This will allow the Russians to supply their forces into the Dnipropetrovsk region without having to worry about the northern flank, where Ukrainian forces are located close to the fortified positions and the settlements. Russians will likely gain control of the remaining parts of the border area over the next coming of days before they start storming the fortified positions next to Novopavlivka from the southern, eastern, and northeastern directions, gain control of Moravka, Novopavlivka, and Filia, which will establish a main foothold across the border area and on the western flank of Pokrovsk. To the south of Kashantinivka, the Russians managed to advance in the direction of Katerinivka and Klebanvik, where the Russians gain control over a fortified position here southwest of Katerinivka, as they continue offensive operations towards the town and along the main road to gain control over both the Klebanvik and Katerinivka, which is on the western flank of this river line here west of Novospassky, and located on the high ground overlooking the towns with several defensive positions on the low ground right next to it. This will allow the Russians to have a better fire control over the road with direct fire controls such as tanks and anti-tank gun missiles that will allow the Russians to completely destroy anything that attempts to move through the border area. It will also allow the Russians to have a wider front alongside the positions of the Ukrainians to strike these encircled positions at the same time as they strengthen their encirclement itself. The Russians also managed to advance to the north of Donetsk in the direction of Delivka, where they are fighting along the fortified positions close to the forest lines that lead up to Bilaora along the canal area. The Russians are looking to flank the recent Ukrainian counterattacks. To attack them directly head on and on the southern flank will increase their possibility of gaining control of these fortified positions, strengthening the positions east of Bilaora and along the canal to connect with their positions in the Chasiv Yar direction. The Russians also advanced north of Chasiv Yar, gaining control of several fortified positions along the canal itself, also expanding the zone of control along the canal for crossings between Kryorivka and Chasiv Yar, strengthening the supply situation of the Russian forces in the area, also advancing northwest of Chasiv Yar towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of Maiske, where they are looking to expand the zone of control, storm the town of Maiske, and generally secure a wider area for their supplies to be concentrated on the western bank of the canal and the vicinity of Chasiv Yar for future offensive operations towards the city of Kashantinivka, gain control over the towns and settlements, as well as fortified positions within the vicinity of Chasiv Yar. Further north, the Russians made additional advances across the Cerebel river line. The Russians managed to advance in the direction of Lushenkove, mainly within the Kharkiv region, where they are gaining a foothold in the southern parts of the town, gain control over the forest patches in the area. This is to cut off the supplies of the Ukrainian forces, trying to regain control over Ritkodub. The Russians are here fighting over the northern and southern flank, where they are storming Lushenkove and the rear of the Ukrainian forces to cut off the supply lines and destroy their forces, moving across the river line to target Ritkodub and then onwards towards Nove. With this, the Russians are preventing a Ukrainian counterattack that could strike the Russian logistical hub in the area and expanding the zone of control along the river line itself to further strengthen their flank here in the direction where the Russians also storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here east of Novomir, gaining control over the eastern flank of the town, will allow the Russians to move on to the northern parts of it, gaining full control of it, will allow the Russians to advance further in the northern direction and in the western direction on the northern flank of Lushenkove. Further north, the Russians also managed to advance within the town of Lushirka. The Russians made their first advance within the town in many, many months. Following the Russian capture of the first patch area here north of Kostynikivka, the Russians are continuing their offensive operations in the direction of Kubiansk on the southern flank for the first time in a long time. This is to strengthen the offensive operations here in the Kubiansk direction. As for the Sumi region, as is previously mentioned, the Ukrainians started launching counterattacks following a rotation of forces in this direction, where the objective is to completely block the Russian offensive operation, which they succeeded very early on, as once the Ukrainians sent reinforcements and especially launched a lot more FPV drone strikes and artillery strikes, the Russians withdrew to more defensible positions and went mainly on the defensive for the most of the front line, except for Yunikivka, where offensive operations continue to gain full control over the town. The Ukrainians are mainly targeting the Russian forces in this direction because they're on the move and not entrenched, which significantly improves the effectiveness of FPV drone strikes, while striking these other areas will be practically useless because the Russian forces are entrenched, and therefore the main battles are currently taking place over Yunikivka and the first patch areas near Satki, where the Russians are switching between the offensive and defensive, while the rest of the front line, the Russians are completely on the defensive, trying to inflict as many casualties on the Ukrainians as possible and slow down their ability to rotate from this section of the front line to other sections of the front line, where the Russians are launching the offensive operations in the Kupiansk, Cerebel River, Kashantinivka, southwest Donetsk, and Zaporizhia sections of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.